About 460 kilometers north of Moscow, in the Vologda province, a small lake rests upon a sprawling woodland. The lake is called Novozero, and in its middle stands an island called Ognenny Ostrov. Despite its name, meaning fiery island or fire island, it is surrounded by ice most of the year, connected to the mainland only by a narrow bridge. Fire Island is home to one of the most desolate prisons of the Russian penitentiary system. Its official name is prison number OE256/5, but convicts simply call it Pyatak, or /5 in Russian. At least until 2009, the high-security prison, known as Russia's Alcatraz, housed 170 convicts, amongst the most violent criminals in the country. Unlike other famous prisons in the Russian Federation, like the infamous Black Dolphin, Pyatak is not the scene of violent clashes amongst rival gangs, or rape or drug abuse. Sure, violence is still present, although it's just not that frequent. Life is relatively calm and slow-paced, but there is something about /5 that drills into the minds of its inmates. Something subtle, and yet something as brutal and as soul-destroying as constant bullying and the abuse of power. It is the relentless regime of isolation, the absolute pointlessness of an empty life that can make the most merciless man beg for death. This is the island where your very soul will deteriorate if tuberculosis doesn't get you first. Welcome to Pyatak, the most terrifying prison in Russia. The first recorded settlement on the fiery island was not a place of punishment, rather a place for prayer and meditation. In 1517, the local Orthodox cleric Cyril of Novozero, later St. Cyril, witnessed a column of fire descending upon the island, hence its current name. Interpreting the apparition as a divine sign, Cyril decided to fund a monastery. After 4 centuries of secluded prayer, the October Revolution put the Bolsheviks in power. Their militant atheism put them at odds with the Orthodox faith, which led to the confiscation of much of the church's wealth and possessions. Thus, St. Cyril's monastery was seized by the government and converted into a prison to lock up enemies of the revolution. The prison maintained its political function throughout the 1930s and 1940s. This is when Stalin's regime used it as a penal colony for the victims of the purges which had struck at the party and military elites of the Soviet Union. In 1953, following Stalin's death, Khrushchev's process of de-Stalinization led to the closing of many secure facilities that were dedicated to political dissidents. In the case of the island's prison, this was simply converted to a standard penitentiary housing ordinary criminals, albeit the most violent and dangerous ones. So let's fast forward 40 years. The Soviet Union has collapsed and it's been replaced by the Russian Federation and the Confederation of Independent States. Up until the mid-1990s, the death penalty was still part of the Russian judiciary system. Capital executions were carried out by means of a pistol shot to the back of the head. But on the 16th of May 1996, a decree by President Boris Yeltsin ordered a gradual reduction of the death penalty in preparation for Russia's entry into the Council of Europe. In September 1996, authorities carried out the last capital sentence on Russian soil, even though the death penalty was still enforced in Chechnya until 1999. A 10-year moratorium on death sentences was then extended up until today. But what happened then to those criminals that would have previously been sentenced to a gunshot to the back of the head? Following Yeltsin's decree, 681 convicted criminals awaiting execution had their sentences commuted to life, or at the very least 25 years in prison. Many of them were condemned to the next possible harshest punishment, to spend the rest of their lives in the unrelenting white purgatory of Pyatak. Now let's look in detail at the structure and surroundings of the prison. The prison buildings occupy almost all of the surface of the tiny island. The edges of the island are entirely contained by 2 concentric sets of walls with watchtowers at every corner. Armed guards and police dogs patrol the perimeter. There are only 2 ways in and out of Fiery Island, either by foot along a narrow wooden bridge or by prison boat. All around are the waters of Lake Novozero, also known as White Lake. Despite the sinister reputation of the islands, this lake is one of Russia's most beautiful. The water is rich with fish and waterfowl, its shores surrounded by acre upon acre of tundra. The natural beauty of the area is undisputed, just like its desolation. To give you an idea, one of the most important inhabited centers in the area is the town of Belozersk. This is the administrative capital of the Belozersky district. It counts barely 9,000 inhabitants in its population, and it's been declining since 1989. If you were an inmate at Pyatak Island and somehow you managed to climb both sets of walls, evade the guards and their German shepherds, you would still have to swim to the shore in icy waters. Or alternatively, you'd have to run the length of the wooden bridge as the wardens take aim from the watchtowers. Even if you made it to shore, you would still have to survive a trek of kilometers in harsh climate and unforgiving environments. And even if you made it out of the woods, you would have little chance to make yourself inconspicuous amongst the small towns and villages of the region. It's no wonder then that nobody has ever escaped from Pyatak. We've now looked at the prison from the outside, but what about life inside it? What is it that makes it quite so terrifying? The prison's regime, its rules, are simple yet effective in achieving their goals. The main weapon of choice used by prison authorities to punish convicts and break their spirits is ruthless isolation. Upon arrival, each prisoner is placed in a small cell with another inmate. Few distractions are allowed, certainly not TV or books. During the daytime, the bed is stowed away and the inmates are forced to stand or sit on a tiny wooden perch a few inches wide. This goes on for 22.5 hours every single day. Infractions are punished with even starker isolation. Misbehaving prisoners are sent to be locked for a minimum of 15 days in small, dark rooms with only a metal bucket as company. For the first 10 years of the convict's sentence, they are allowed only 2 visits per year. Each visit can last no longer than 2 hours. After the 10 years have expired, men are allowed 2 additional visits per year, but of shorter duration. Convicts are able to receive parcels from family and friends, but again, these are limited to only 2 per year. It's no surprise then that by the time a decade has passed, most of the prisoners have lost all contact with their families. Due to the huge size of Russia's territory, it's also common that most convicts' families would have to travel for days and then spend only a couple of hours with their loved ones. Valery, a Siberian multiple murderer interviewed by The Telegraph in 2004, told how he had asked his wife to seek a divorce upon learning he was being sentenced to Pyatak. He had realized that maintaining their relationship, it would have been impossible. When I came here, I told my wife to get a divorce. She cried a little, and we've never seen each other since. Sanitary conditions are also dire. The prison structure is devoid of any proper washing facilities or lavatories. Inmates just have to make do with a bucket. And what of exercise or walks in the yard, a staple of life in every prison around the world? Technically, men at Pyatak are allowed some of it, but it's more of a cruel joke. For an hour and a half a day, they are permitted to walk in the open, but this is more like the pacing of a trapped predatory animal in cages sized only 2 meters by 2 meters, with no room nor equipment for physical activity. Only the most determined manage to maintain decent levels of fitness. This situation surely contributes to the deteriorating health of most inmates, most of whom were already ill when ending up behind bars. According to a human rights report from the US State Department, AIDS and drug-resistant tuberculosis are endemic. In general, conditions at Pyatak are deemed to be extremely harsh and frequently life-threatening. Earlier, I mentioned that there are only 2 ways out of Pyatak, by bridge or by boat. But there are other ways out, and one of them is with your feet first, inside of a body bag. When a man dies, if his body is unclaimed by relatives, then it is taken to a small village graveyard near the island. Bodies are buried with little ceremony under markers bearing serial numbers instead of names. Usually this is all in just the presence of 1 or 2 of the guards. No prisoners can attend the burials. Another option used by prisoners is self-harm. Prison officials claim that convicts frequently swallow metal objects such as teapot handles, spoons, and bundles of nails in the hope that they will be sent to the relative peace of prison wards and hospitals. The harsh conditions, the crushing feelings of loneliness and emptiness, have prompted many of the hardened criminals to seek solace in religion. But guards, they're skeptical of these late conversions. Chief Warden Vasily Smirnov, interviewed by the Houston Chronicle in 2005, declared that finding religion is just a means for prisoners to be receiving money and parcels from foreign evangelical groups. He stated that many use the pages from religious books as toilet paper. So who are the residents of Pyatak, and what crimes have they committed to deserve a life of nothingness? One tragic and exemplary case is that of Vyacheslav Sharyevsky. During the last days of the Soviet Union, Vyacheslav was a rising star in the Soviet judicial system. Aged just 29, he was a top prosecutor in the Smolensk region of Russia, holding almost godlike powers over the locals. He had even been called to investigate and then to bust a large-scale corruption ring in Uzbekistan. But one day in 1989, something went deeply wrong inside his head. He was overcome with with boredom. He had grown weary of his life, and he wanted to feel alive again, so he decided to kill. He grabbed a knife and stabbed to death 2 women that he barely knew, a bookkeeper and a cashier, and he also stole their money. Vyacheslav was sentenced to death. The day on which Vyacheslav's head was due to meet the cold muzzle of a pistol, a prison official came to the execution cell and told him that his life would be spared. It was May of 1996, the year of Yeltsin's moratorium on all executions. He declared to British journalist Julius Strauss, "I expected the executioner, and instead Jesus Christ came. Since then, I have prayed to God every day. I thank him for the sun, the sky, life, and our bread." Another inmate interviewed by Strauss was identified only as Vladimir. In 1994, in St. Petersburg, he had killed 2 men and 2 women. The motive for the killing? He says, "I was drunk." Not all of the residents of the island are psychopaths or occasional murderers. There are reports of at least one terrorist being kept there, Nopashi Kuliev, who may be Pyatak's most notorious convict. Kuliev was the only survivor of a militant cell of Chechen insurgents that in September of 2004 attacked a school in Beslan in North Ossetia. On the 1st of September, Kuliev and 31 other terrorists stormed the school, taking more than 1,000 hostages, including primary and secondary school children. The hostages were herded into the school gym, which was rigged with explosives. After 2 tense days, explosions from inside prompted the Russian security forces to launch an all-out assault against the insurgents. Their response, it was disproportionate, including the deployment of flamethrowers, grenade launchers, and heavy machine guns. In the ensuing battle, 333 hostages, many of them young children, died at the hands of the Chechen terrorists and possibly by friendly fire. All the insurgents were killed except for Kalayev. He survived the gunfight but was almost lynched by a local mob. At the ensuing trial, Kalayev denied killing anyone, but in May of 2016, he received a life sentence for terrorist acts. His sentence was to be served inside Pyatak. The following year, he was rumored to have died in custody, a likely outcome considering the usual harsh conditions of Fiery Island, plus potential retribution at the hands of other convicts. News about Kalayev and about Pyatak in general after 2007 are hard to come by. However, in 2014, Kalayev resurfaced in a documentary that was aired by Russia Today. The documentary identifies the penal colony in which he is being held simply with the number 18. However, in one shot, he appears to be pacing inside one of the 2x2 cages in which prisoners are allowed to walk at Pyatak. In the documentary, Kalayev reads some letters sent to him by parents of Beslan's victims. He appears confident, dismissive of the letters, and generally unrepentant. But Alyevtina Luchnikova, a senior psychologist at the detention facility, attests to Kalayev's deteriorating mental state, stating, "When I talk to him, he confessed he often has nightmares. He sees blood coming from the walls." Back in 2004, another psychologist at Pyatak, Svetlana Kiselyova, had described to The Telegraph the effects of the prison's enforced isolation. After 3 or 4 years, their personalities begin to deteriorate. There is no way anyone can spend 25 years in a place like this without being psychologically destroyed. Curiously, she added, the homosexuals are the ones who come off best. At least they are not starved of physical and emotional contact. This sounds peculiar, as solitary confinement would also apply to homosexual detainees. These remarks aside, Kiselyova made an important point. The lack of human contact, the lack of any form of mental stimulus, may cause one's personality to gradually just break apart. But what exactly are the psychiatric effects of solitary confinement in a structure such as Pyatak? Well, according to a paper published by Dr. Stuart Grassian of Washington University in 2006, solitary confinement and institutional isolation can bring about a very specific psychiatric syndrome. To clarify, a syndrome is a set of symptoms which consistently occur together. The symptoms identified by Dr. Grassian are hyperresponsivity to external stimuli, in other words, the inability to tolerate external stimuli such as most ordinary noises, perceptual distortions, illusions, and hallucinations. Dr. Grassian interviewed inmates across 200 penitentiaries in the US, almost a third of whom reported hearing frightening, whispering voices. Panic attacks, which occurred in more than half of the inmates interviewed. Difficulty in thinking, concentrating, and retaining memories. Once you're in a position where you start losing your memories and you don't have the opportunity to create new ones, that's when your whole personality, your whole sense of self, starts to fade away. Obsessive thoughts, mainly associated with violent fantasies of torture and mutilation. Feelings of paranoia and persecutory fears often deteriorating into overt psychosis, loss of impulse control resulting in acts of random violence or, more often, self-harm and suicide attempts. The syndrome identified by Dr. Gracian was, in his own words, strikingly unique. That is, some of the symptoms described here are found in virtually no other psychiatric illness, especially the perceptual distortions. In layman's terms, isolation does not just make you crazy, it makes you a very specific kind of crazy. A kind of crazy observed in only one other medical condition: delirium, an acute organic brain syndrome characterized by abnormalities in EEGs and brain scans. This means the symptoms brought about by isolation are consistent with those of a neurological rather than just a psychiatric disorder. Trying to simplify again, they are consistent with the symptoms typical of a disease of the brain as an organ rather than a behavioral disorder. This seems to suggest that isolation and solitary confinement have an impact on the neurological structure and organic functioning of the brain. Dr. Gracian's long-term studies of former prisoners of war, kidnap victims, and prison inmates have demonstrated that many of the symptoms outlined here tend to subside after release from confinement. However, there are also some long-term effects which persist for decades. These include persistent symptoms of post-traumatic stress, such as flashback, chronic hypervigilance, and a constant sense of hopelessness. In addition, these individuals also experience long-lasting personality changes. The most alarming is a pattern of rejection of any social interaction. Survivors will feel socially impoverished and withdrawn, even angry or fearful, when forced into social isolation. In general, they have displayed patterns of behavior dramatically different from their mental states prior to solitary confinement. If any of the convicts from Pyatak or similar institutions around the world were to make it back to society, they would be utterly incapable of interacting or functioning with it in any way. Dr. Gracian concludes by highlighting the paradox of isolation and solitary confinement as a correctional tactic, saying, "Most of the prisoners housed in long-term solitary confinement facilities such as Pyatak are undoubtedly a danger to the community, as well as to fellow convicts and to prison staff. But in most cases, they are not a danger because they are coldly ruthless, but because they are driven by impulse, internally disorganized, riddled with paranoia, and volatile. Isolation and its associated syndrome only contribute to feed this volatility and potential for explosive violence in a self-perpetuating circle." It's not up to us to judge whether Russia or the United States should entirely reconsider their prison system. A penitentiary like Pyatak/5 may be the only alternative available to the death penalty or to more traditional and violent prisons, the only alternative available to act as a deterrent to the most violent elements of society, or at least the only alternative given existing resources. What is a fact is that Pyatak is for sure not only one of the bleakest and most impenetrable prisons in Russia, but it may be one of the bleakest and most impenetrable places on Earth. Period. To quote again Chief Guard Vasily Smirnov, "It's necessary to understand one thing. The difference between this prison and others is that in other places, prisoners see the light at the end of the tunnel. Here, it's all darkness." But even among the darkness, a glimmer of hope can be found. A minuscule spark of a mind on a resistance mission against total deterioration. Do you remember Vladimir, the drunken murderer of St. Petersburg? Unlike other fellow prisoners, he found a way to cope with isolation and prevent the breakdown of his psyche. Soon after entering Pyatak, he took up oil painting, transforming his cell into a gallery of rural Russian landscapes, all painted from memory. Perhaps the only one to say so, he declared, "I don't want to leave here. I've made this room my home. One day it will be my mausoleum. Who knows? Perhaps after my death I will be famous and people will come and visit this cell. They'll say of me, he might have been a murderer, but at least he was a fine painter." So I hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. And don't forget to subscribe. This is a brand new channel, so your subscription really does make a difference. And also hit that bell so you find out when we put out new videos. Leave me a comment to let me know how this was for you. Did you enjoy it? What did you think of it? Please do that below. I'll see you next time.